Gadfly subscribers, this is Ken with London Paul, and we are here today. It is Wednesday, July 8th, to discuss numerous things going on: economics, finance, geopolitics, and anything that comes to our minds. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you for coming here today. And what do you got on the docket in your neck of the woods?
Well, maybe we'll park the UK's neck of the woods for a second, but we will come back to that. But obviously, I think we couldn't not mention gold and silver. I don't really want to get bogged down in the price so much. I've always said that for me, gold gets interesting once it hits 2,000, and silver when it hits $50, when we sort of break new ground, so to speak. But I think it's interesting in the sense that, and it backs up what we've said previously. And when I've said it for 7 years, that we would only really see movements in the spot price, like the paper price, essentially, when the West effectively becomes drained of physical metal. And yes, the East has drained the West of enormous amounts. I mean, tens of thousands of tons in the last decade or longer. But the important point is not just the fact that the East is draining the West, but when suddenly there is enormous demand in the West with regards to physical metal. And what we've certainly seen, which is quite unprecedented in recent months, is suddenly with the futures market, via the COMEX, that both in gold and silver, there's suddenly enormous demand for physical delivery, which then puts an enormous strain on physical delivery in the West. And if you sort of factor that into our thinking, then therefore that would start to give us some cause for belief that we're seeing these genuine rises in gold and silver spot prices. I think last I looked, silver was about 1870 and gold was around 1813. Now, I made a point and I tweeted something today regarding what the driver for gold and silver prices was always going to be physical demand. It's not charts. It's not people wanting to drive prices for whatever their own ends might be. People say to me, "Oh, but I can still buy, 10 ounces of gold from a retail dealer." Sorry. Well, that's irrelevant because the volume's piffling. Where it starts to get interesting is when you have in a significant institutional interest, high net worth interest in the West. That renders the paper markets irrelevant. And we're starting to see in COMEX futures where someone or groups of individuals are suddenly saying, no, we don't want to settle in cash. We don't want to roll this over. We want physical delivery. And they're now struggling to meet that demand. And we've seen instances where enormous amounts of gold have headed from London and Switzerland to the US, which has been pretty unprecedented. And it seems as though that indeed is the case with silver, given they're going to have to settle enormous tonnage of silver with regards to futures contracts. Now, this ties in with something we spoke about, I can't remember, maybe 6 weeks ago, something like that, maybe not quite, but ballpark 6 weeks ago, where I said it was said to me that with regards to why you couldn't or you struggled to buy any silver in the UK anywhere is because the primary dealer was not giving the secondary dealers, which is kind of the bullion dealers in the UK, any silver. So effectively they were just getting maybe odd crumbs thrown at them. So they get small amounts, or some of them just can't get hold of any silver. And the reason, therefore, which we can extrapolate from that is that whoever the primary dealer was is sucking as much silver as they can, because ultimately it was all going to go to the US to satisfy the physical demand for the futures contract. And that's entirely possible that they just hoover up whatever they can, goes off to Switzerland, gets recast as bars or whatever you want to, whatever denomination of coin or bar you want, and then heads off to the US. And I think when we look back and extrapolate forward what's happened, that seems to be more or less our understanding is correct. It wasn't clear what the primary dealer was doing, but I think it's pretty obvious now that's why there isn't the physical silver in the UK, that that there always has been. I mean, if I ever wanted to, I could go and buy 500 ounces or more, okay, at retail and very easily. And now it's a real struggle to get hold of any, and in some cases it's practically impossible. And I've heard other people tell me that the similar stories globally. So there is a silver shortage. Now, okay, this is more, well, sort of partly at the retail level and partly outside the retail level. But I think that buys into that theory. And of course, if increasingly people are looking at geopolitical events, okay, whatever people feel about the virus, people are looking at the virus and there's fear that there's going to be a second wave that's going to cripple global economies. That's bigger in people's thinking. There's also concerns about the dollar and global economies irrespective of the virus. So this will increasingly mean more and more people, and therefore, by definition, high net worth individuals or institutions will look at this and say, okay, we want to start having physical delivery. And when you get an enormous volume of demand in the West for physical metal, well, the problem they have is they can't satisfy it because they don't have the physical. So therefore, they've got to get hold of it somehow. But in the end, you're playing kind of musical chairs, trying to juggle physical metal in the Western world. And there comes a point where the price will have to rise, and the paper price will have to, at some point, achieve true price discovery, because then by raising the price, they may, well, the expectation is, which I think is flawed, is that at some point, yes, some people are going to sell. There's no doubt about it. But a lot of people are looking, going, well, I'm not selling, gold and silver now because I'm anticipating extreme adversity in global finance, global economics, geopolitics, and a whole bunch of other things, because everything's kind of coalescing into this world of chaos. And I think that is why we're starting to see some price movement. Now, I'm not going to I see 1800s just psychological. I know there's charts and which indicate all manner of things, but by the end of the day, if there wasn't the physical demand, the price wouldn't be where it is. Although we have seen evidence of at times where the price has tried to be smashed, and it bounces back where it used to take weeks and sometimes didn't. Now it's bouncing back, as we said previously, Ken, within 24 hours, sometimes even less. So it's further indication that there's enormous physical demand. Now the question is, does that demand continue? And it's reasonable to expect that probably will. But if the demand doesn't, and therefore then the price will fall away to some degree. Now, I'm not saying it's going to fall away significantly, and I don't think the demand's going to dry up in any way, shape or form. But there is still a lot of people who, for whatever reason, don't see gold and silver as the answer to the future. They think we're going to just have very deflationary future. They don't see problems with the dollar. They don't see geopolitical problems. They don't see the demise of the US and US hegemony and the US dollar. So there's a lot of reasons why at this stage we don't have an absolute flood, because if we suddenly had a flood of institutional interest and high net worth demand, then we would start to see gold and silver prices move up, not like today over 2% for silver and about 1% for gold. You're going to see significantly greater increases. So the basis for driving the price intelligently going forward is physical demand, not any of the other reasons that people have been chiming on for years about, and why I've said for 7 years, it will never move until physical demand means the West effectively is drained. Well, the argument can be now is it's not exactly drained, but they are playing this musical chairs, trying to move metal around to satisfy physical demand. Well, it's a bit like the old story of Peter and the Dyke. You can only plug so many holes before it becomes impossible. And if things keep progressing the way they are, then that physical demand is likely to increase, but there's no certainty of that. Therefore, as I say, for me, things don't get exciting yet. I mean, I think for me, the geopolitics and the finance and economic and those drivers are more interesting to me, because that's what will drive more interest in terms of physical demand. And therefore, the question is the supply there to meet that demand? And from our perspective, as people who have an interest in it, therefore, we expect or would anticipate seeing increasing physical demand, but you just can't tell in this fickle world as to how people will react. But certainly, since the ridiculous collapse of the paper markets when silver hit $11.50 and the gold hit about $14.50, we've seen a significant rise, and the ability to keep smashing the price has not been forthcoming. And I think that ties in with all our understanding and all our previous analysis as to what was going on between obviously the LBMA and the COMEX.
The interesting thing, and this is something I talked about with Jim yesterday on our podcast, there's two, besides the perfect storm of central banks buying it, especially over the past 18 months, pretty much going back to December of about 2018, when the Fed ordered that, well, we've got to stop lessening our balance sheet and we got to drop interest rates. That was really when the next acceleration started doing. But because of the fact that with the lockdowns, the closing of borders, most of the silver, I think about between 60 and 70% of the silver that is produced is done as a byproduct of base metals, nickel, iron, tin, things like that. So what ends up happening is most of these base metal miners, copper, etc., they really don't care about silver. But what they do care about is their credit lines and the interest on the loans that they get from the banks. And since most of the banks that provide them the loans are also the bullion dealers, who are the ones playing in the spot and futures market, the COMEX, they have been making deals with a lot of these miners, these base metal miners. Hey, you give us your silver and we'll provide you really cheap interest rates on loans on your credit line. And the copper miners and the nickel miners and that, they're like lithium miners. Hey, we'll take that. And that's how the bullion banks have been able to get a supply of silver to keep that manipulation in the futures market and the COMEX going on. Well, guess what? The lockdowns, especially by different countries, because most of the silver production is taking place outside of the U.S., those nations, not only have they shut down the mining because of workers potentially getting COVID, but they're not doing any deliveries out. They're not exporting outside the country. So it's created, a forced shortage that way. Secondly, a lot of the base metal miners have really slowed down their own production because the world's in a depression. There's not a demand for these. There was that one spurt, I think, in middle May where China was like buying everything, oil, commodities, but that slowed down quite a bit. Thirdly, what we've had is with the silver is that even the online bullion dealers, they have such, what we had also the mint. And it's going to tie into something I want to talk about here that's going on in the States. The mint actually slowed down. We had the Swiss refiners shut down for about a 1 month period. A lot of the supply that the bullion dealers would get from the mint hasn't coalesced. And it's interestingly as well, you had news out yesterday that the mint suddenly is going to ramp up silver because they know that the prices, at least at this point, the potential of the price getting out of hand of their control is legitimate and real. Finally, last thing, we know that with gold in the COMEX, they pretty much run out of 100 ounce bars. So they've had to go over to the LBMA, which has 400 ounce bars, and use their exchange for paper to try to tie into using gold from London. Well, here's the fascinating thing. Not only did they create these contracts in the COMEX about a month ago that were 400 ounce bars instead of contracts for 100 ounce bars, they decided they'd pull up this new thing. We're going to sell fractional shares. on these contracts. Well, after 1 month, the data finally came out. Craig Hemke posted this out on Twitter yesterday. You know how many actual individuals, whether retailers, investment houses, whatever, bought into these 400-ounce contracts? 8. 8 total contracts were done.
Non-existent.
Non-existent. No, they're not putting up with this crap. So those that know about the shenanigans that are being done between the COMEX and the LBMA, they're just ignoring it completely. And so, with that being said, you're right. As long as the New York, London cabal establishment can still set the price, and it's being recognized primarily throughout the world. And the reason I think it's primarily done is because the spot price has nothing to do with the physical markets anymore. It's tied solely to the paper markets, including the ETFs like SLV and GLD. But the futures market, we've already talked about this before, has divested itself, disconnected. As a matter of fact, with the spot price of gold being at $8.12 at the moment, the futures price is at $18.21. Okay, so it's about $10 off. But here's the kicker. Where silver is at $18.66 in the spot market, it's at $19.05 right now in the futures market. So silver in the futures is over 19. That, take into account somebody's place like I believe SD Bullion, if you go there and want to sell them your silver, they're doing spot plus $3.50 because they're selling it for $24 to $26. So the real physical price, the futures price, and the spot price have completely disconnected, and it's just going to be a matter of time when the world rejecting the dollar. When is the world going to reject the New York London control over that spot price? And when that happens, Katie, bar the door.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points to add to that. Conventional wisdom always understands that the biggest silver producers in the world are, well, the principal two is Mexico and Peru. I can't remember the exact figures. I think Mexico's around 600,000 tons a year. It's around 27,000 tons global of silver production. Mexico's about 6. I think Peru's around 4. Now, China is notionally set to produce around 3,500 tons a year. Well, would it surprise anyone that China is the world's largest silver producer? Because once again, it never tells the world what it's really doing. It's like Russia's supposed to be about 2,000 tons a year. It's significantly greater than 2,000 tons a year. And the thing that China and Russia do is, they don't sell any of the silver. So in terms of, yes, you're absolutely right. Some miners have been kind of furloughed, for want of a better word, or they've gone into care and maintenance mode, so they're not producing anymore. I think the other thing worth mentioning, the real reason why there is such a desire to suppress gold and by extension silver, because it's all about confidence in the dollar, and the dollar is a matter of national security and has to be preserved as such. So if gold also was suddenly, for argument's sake, 2,500, and then went to 3,000 and 3,500 and 4, the world would look at the dollar and go, well, apart from already having serious reservations about the dollar. But we're talking before everything that's happened now. The reason to suppress that is just about confidence in the dollar. And that's the motivation more than anything to suppress the price of gold and silver. And the other thing is, there's people who continue getting in touch with me saying the US does have 8,000 tons of gold, which I'm sorry to say they don't have. But the point is, if the US had 8,000 tons of gold, they wouldn't be going out their way to continually smash the price of gold. It's a very crude analogy, but it's a statement of fact. The US has no gold, so it has no interest in smashing the price or preserving the price or allowing the price of gold to reach price discovery. But in terms of what happens going forward, I don't know. I'm not really that concerned at this point as to to the price of gold and silver. I mean, I know the psychological barriers and it gets a lot of people very excited, but to me, unless we have continual physical demand, when we're seeing that, then for now at least the price will keep rising, and it will, or at least be maintained. If that physical demand drops off, which it may or may not do, then the price might move accordingly. And at the end of the day, it's irrelevant to the long-term future if you invest in it. And we're not giving investment advice because that's not what we're here to do. But if you're interested in it and you want to try and make a quick 5-10%, well, fine, if that's what you want to do. But if you want to protect your assets or protect your wealth, that's the reason. So yeah, I don't get bogged down in all the endless TA and all that, because frankly, after 7 years of saying why it's irrelevant in the long term, I think there's some vindication why what I've said is correct. And therefore, from my perspective, I don't see a huge amount of importance. I think the importance of why the price is rising at any given point is what's the physical reality that supports this, and the physical reality is supporting this. And therefore, the argument is, well, that physical demand keeps coming, and we'll see if that does happen. Then obviously, correspondingly, there's going to be more and more of a struggle to suppress the spot price, and therefore it will have to start to marry up with physical demand. And if they have to end up raising the price of gold to try and get people to sell, and and that's the when you start to achieve price discovery, then the demand supply curve becomes a reality, not this huge distortion. Although we do have to say, and I think it's important to make this point, is yes, there has been demand to some extent in the West, but I don't think the demand has been as significant till the last 2 or 3 months in the West or as significant, since probably 2010-11. And I'm not saying there hasn't been demand, and there has been, but not to the extent we're seeing now. And at the end of the day, the argument people will say, well, why don't China and Russia just reprice gold? Well, why would they, when they could still keep hoovering up gold at what they believe is extremely cheap prices? Why would you? There is no value to them to do that. There's no point. And again, it comes back to this point that people will say, well, yes, China could crash the dollar. China could just come out and say, we've dumped $500 billion of US Treasury. But can you imagine the propaganda and how the story would be spun by the US that China was trying to destroy the dollar and China was trying to destroy the national security of America? And they just spin the story in such an obscene way that to make China look like the big bad ogre, which is what they've done precisely in every way possible for 2 years. So are you going to give them a gun so they can point it at your head? No. They will just do what they have to do and keep taking advantage of whatever gold they can buy, and therefore let sort of nature take its course, let the dollar do what the dollar's going to do to itself, and not be seen to be onerously interfering in that regard. And therefore, from their perspective, is the more gold they can buy and the more dollars they can dump, the better. So why rock that boat? So there's no need for them to do that. But at some point in the future, China will reprice gold, because, as people keep saying, China can't back their currency with gold. Well, they have 40,000 tons of gold. And if they want to, they can just come out tomorrow and say on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, for argument's sake, we're going to reprice gold at, let's just say they say $3,000 an ounce. What do people imagine would happen? There would be this enormous drain of metal. Whatever was left in the West would then head east, because people would arbitrage and think, well, I can buy it cheaper in the West temporarily, sell temporarily at that, buy, get it right, buy at that much cheaper price, and then arbitrage and sell it to China. And China then can therefore hoover up even more metal in the process. But at some point, China will come out and say, we're repricing gold, and on that basis, we're going to back our currency. And that's the whole reason why anybody can back their currency with gold if they have the physical metal and they have the capability to reprice it. And why do people think the Shanghai Gold Exchange exists and the Shanghai Silver Exchange exists, for that matter? It's for that very reason that at some point they want to take a increasingly dominant position in the gold market, which is if you buy an ounce of or take an ounce contract, for argument's sake, it's backed by a physical ounce of metal, where China knows and most other people know if you buy from the COMEX and the LBMA, it's questionable what it's backed by, if and to what extent, and that is a statement of fact, not some sort of fictional idea that we and countless other people have. So I think these are important points to mention also.
Well, it's true. The thing that, to me, that holds China back from really internationalizing is if you buy gold from Shanghai Gold Exchange, guess what? You can't take it. All the gold stays in China. Now you can vault it there, and maybe that's what they're going to use Hong Kong for, as they take over that financial center. But at least in Dubai, in that place, you can at least deliver outside of the country or outside of their jurisdiction. So that's where things got to change. But with that being said, I want to divest real quick to something I just noticed, and it makes me wonder. I'm speculating here, but it makes me wonder if the paper futures prices for commodities are really starting to break here in the West. Going back to the last market day of the week before the July 4th holiday was Thursday. And I'm taking a look really quick at the West Texas Intermediate Crude futures contract for July. The closing price on Thursday, July 2nd, was $40.65. Today, we've had what? 1, 2, 3. This is 4 trading days. The price right now is $4 or $40.55. We've had just a 10-cent diversion in the futures contract over the last 4 trading days. It's like a straight flat tabletop line. Yesterday, when I did my the other day when I did my market wrap up, there was 0. The change was 0. I mean, not 18 cents, not $1.18. It was 0. And then looking at it earlier today, it was just 1 penny. So I know oil is really a big issue, and they've talked. There was some news that came out that, but I'm wondering if they're starting to lose control over the futures contracts, especially with all this artificial money that's propping up everything. Is there really no integrity at all left in the paper markets?
Well, yeah, I think the issue with oil is that, I mean, setting aside the debacle of the settlement at minus $40 in April, I mean, well, let's not worry too much about that. But in a broad sense, it's why we've always said that when OPEC became OPEC plus, effectively Russia and Saudi Arabia were dictating the oil markets. Now, in terms of, they're the ones saying, well, we're going to have production cuts, we're not going to have production cuts. And also in the process, of course, is that while you have OPEC plus, you might as well tag China onto that. And really, from China's perspective, they don't care what the spot price of oil is in whether it's WTI, whether it's Brent, is of no relevance to them, because China says to whatever nation, whether it's Saudi, the Iranians, whoever else, we'll buy all the oil you've got, but we're dictating the price. So I don't care whether the spot price is $40 a barrel or 45 or 35. We're going to pay this price, and we're going to buy this much of you on a monthly, annual basis. And the seller's going, well, okay, fine. And China is then able to start to dictate and say, well, okay, in Venezuela's case, they're not going to obviously give them dollars because it's pointless. Or Iran, it's not going to be traded in dollars. But this is why with the Saudis increasingly they are trading in RMB, not entirely, but an increasing proportion of oil is now being traded in what you might term the petro-yuan, because we've had a complete shift in the dynamic where it's not the seller now who dictates anything, it's the buyer. And China's this enormous buyer of oil that is able to now start to say, well, and that's why really the futures price is of no relevance. It can function as it is, but it's really just a derivatives tool now. It doesn't bear any relation to the price that that a seller, say Saudi sells to China, or Saudi sells to anyone else for that matter. Everybody negotiates separately, and the spot price bears no relation, that's why I think we're seeing these spot prices become sort of irrelevant. Really, it's just a derivatives trading mechanism now, and therefore, consequently, it becomes something of an irrelevance. But at one time, of course, it was very much indicative of setting the price of how much you would pay for a barrel of oil. And here's the truth of the matter: if there was a big desire to drive the price of oil up, because they think, well, China's a big consumer, so we're going to make them pay even more. And China just turns around and goes, no, we're not, because we've negotiated a 2-year contract with the Saudis and we're paying $35 a barrel or $30 a barrel. But that's not the entire deal, because there's all these fringe benefits with regards to future trade and development. And China's offering the world a lot of sweeteners, and the Saudis are taking them. Obviously, the Iranians will, etc., etc. Venezuela is another example. So it's not just a simple trade-off anymore between buying a barrel of oil and paying anything relating to spot price. So the spot price can do whatever it likes, but it bears no relation to the real oil market.
Real quick on that, what you just said is a good transition segue. What are your thoughts on the announcement of a military partnership between Iran and China that took place, I believe, yesterday?
Right. Well, I don't mind. Occasionally, I'll cross it. I did an enormous piece on my own podcast yesterday, which actually I originally discussed this in sort of late August last year with regards to what was coming with in terms of a very comprehensive trade deal, etc., between China and Iran, and by extension Russia. And I've said for a very long time, China will economically backstop Iran, and Russia will militarily backstop Iran. And that is proved to be the case. I think the issue with Iran that most people in the West don't understand is, setting aside any of the internal problems, which do exist, that is true. There is no doubt it has internal problems, but not the way the US would like to make it out to be. But at the end of the day, Iran is extremely rich in resources in terms of oil, gas, other minerals. It also has enormous gold reserves. It's probably behind Russia and China in terms of its gold holding. Is not clear to what extent they have. I've heard stories it has 20,000 tons, but I can't confirm or otherwise that. But okay, it has enormous gold reserves. We know that much. But if China is willing to put in hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into Iran, because it knows full well, just look at its geographical location, it can become an extremely important hub in the Belt Road Initiative. Iran, of course, is very keen to do this. It wants to build out its allies in the Middle East. It's kind of normalized relations, obviously, with the Iraqis, which is extremely important. It has good relations with Qatar. To an extent, it's improving relations with Turkey. Privately, it's having discussions with Saudi, who's supposed to be the arch enemy. And the US and Israel are looking at this going, and this is what this is really all about, is because if Iran comes in from the cold, in the true sense of the word, then of course the reality is then that it will be the biggest power in the Middle East, and that's something, of course, that's an abomination to Israel, and never mind the US. So In terms of military requirements that Iran has, yes, Russia provides that, but China, I've always said, China was the stalking horse in the Middle East. They do a lot more in nations like Syria than people realize. Russia takes a lot of the heat for this, but they have military engagement in Syria to some extent. But with Iran, yes, Iran will give Russia and China access to all their ports. It will give them access to all their military bases, and in a way, it's a sort of mechanism by which the United States has to look at this and go, well, maybe that's why, for argument's sake, well, it's one of many reasons why when the US was going to launch a military or a missile attack on Iran, and Trump, with 10 minutes to go, backed out of it. Well, apart from Russia's military superiority, a lot of the fact is Iran has military technology that is kind of focused US military minds to the extent that they're a little bit wary of tackling Iran in of itself, never mind what Russia and China may be able to present as also as a way of defending Iranians' military position. I mean, of course, Iran has always got the threat and has said it will close the Straits of Hormuz, which would have a devastating impact on the price of oil. We talk about things that would impact the price of oil. Of course, oil would skyrocket to $100 a barrel in the blink of an eye. Though of that, there's absolutely no doubt, which in the current climate for Western economies would be an absolute disaster. And it's another reason why China's buying up every barrel of oil it can get its hands on, in case that very scenario happens. And it's got the buffer of saying, well, this is what we consume on an annual basis, but we've got all this extra storage, and Russia's perfectly fine as well, obviously, from its own perspective. So, sorry, go on.
I was going to say that's an interesting point right there too, is because when you think about it, Trump's push to increase shale oil and at a certain point make the U.S. the biggest producer of oil in the world. What they've done is, as we entered into this global recession / depression, is the U.S. actually shot its own foot by overproducing to the point that it's now unprofitable, and where the shale companies are starting to go into, and I think we talked about this last week, Chesapeake and a few others are starting to go through bankruptcy or sell off large portions of their company. Is that we're also seeing the complete not just the consolidation, but the complete breakup of OPEC, because China is dealing with each OPEC country individually, not waiting for a consensus price. They may end up paying more to Iran because it's beneficial in that, hey, we're getting military access. Where with Saudis, they're saying, you know what, you're in desperate need of cash. You're going to pay our price. So they can make different prices to either, because I have not heard really anything come out over the past month, 1 to 3 months, since that last OPEC meeting in Vienna, where they really didn't come out with any production cuts. And that I haven't really heard OPEC nations talking about any of the other countries, falling by the wayside. I think that it's now become a free-for-all, and China, of course, is dictating the market, and they're doing it on an individual, bilateral basis with each of the individual OPEC countries.
Yeah, exactly, and it's become a buyer's market, not a seller's market. I mean, at the end of the day, for the last, well, maybe not so much probably now, but certainly during April and May, China was effectively propping up all these nations by buying up all their oil, and not exclusively, but huge amounts of excess oil. They were just hoovering up because obviously suppliers want to get rid of it. And China, if people have got a glut of supply and they've got nowhere to store it, and someone comes along and says, well, I can help you with that, but but I want the oil at a significant discount. What's the alternative? You cease production because you have all this supply and you can't have anywhere to store it, or do you actually just take whatever you can get for it? And yeah, it's you can argue it's a ruthless world we live in, but China's going, well, you know, you might argue it's ruthless in one sense, but at the end of the day, if China wasn't buying this up, a lot of these oil producing nations would be in even bigger trouble than selling it at a significant discount to whatever spot price it is. I think it's worth mentioning with regards to the likes of Saudi and Iran and other Middle Eastern nations. They've been long since having negotiations with China over, Saudi's looking at things where they know that the House of Saud is precarious. They know that there's been repeated attempts to overthrow MBS and King Salman by the West, which have failed for now. And they're starting to look and go, well, our oil production is not going to last. In fact, we're now starting to have serious economic problems. So we're going to have to find a new way of building for the future. Now, we can all have our personal opinions about Saudi and its human rights record and all those kind of issues. But the big difference is China sits there and goes, well, yes, you have these problems. Yes, we don't agree with you on this. And Russia has the same attitude. But we're going to work with you. And if we start to work with you and we can build, solid relations, then maybe over a period of time, we can start to influence things, and maybe attitudes and things will change in nations like Saudi Arabia. But you can't go in US style and bully nations and tell them what to do. You have to work and hope maybe over a 5, 10, 15, 20-year period, attitudes will change. But China has leverage where it can start to invest enormous sums of money in Saudi Arabia and say, well, there's the potential to build a Belt and Road Initiative and provide you with a real vision for the future, which, MBS has visions which are a bit myopic and don't make a lot of economic or strategic sense. But there is certainly scope to build out Saudi Arabia in different ways. And therefore, China's in a position to do this. And this comes back to why, people keep saying, oh, China's short of dollars and China doesn't have enough dollars for that. And China has got more dollars than it wants. It has probably not $13 trillion of Forex anymore, probably 12, I don't know. But for argument's sake, they've spent a huge amounts of money in the last 2 or 3 years. But they still have enormous amounts of Forex reserves. And people go, well, that's impossible. Well, look alone at China's trade surplus on an annual basis. This is a nation, it's not the United States who has enormous budget deficit problems, and it's a far different economy. It's an economy that actually has worked for the Chinese extremely well for a great number of years. And people make comparisons between China and the US, and there's just no comparison. If you have the world's reserve currency and you print the dollar, or just expect nations to take worthless IOU so you can have some free dollars, China hasn't been doing that. Yes, there's the argument about China and this enormous amount of credit, and we're not going to have that discussion today because we've discussed it previously. But China has this huge surplus of dollars, and it's saying, okay, well, we can go and invest hundreds of billions of dollars in Iran, and we're going to get a return on it. It helps to stabilize the Iranian economy. And the other thing is, it's all done in non-dollar terms. Yeah. And that's the enormous difference as well, that they can both work with each other outside the SWIFT system. And therefore, the US can leverage whatever sanctions it likes and whatever individuals, but the nations say, well, it's irrelevant. We can just keep doing what we're doing. And that's why it's extremely important for to try and stabilize Iran and to give it some economic incentives to keep progressing and changing. Now, that's why the US walking away from the JCPOA was a disaster. It was a disaster for the United States. It was very damaging to their international relations, but it was solely done because they expected Iran to walk away. They expected Iran to break resolutions, and therefore they'd have an excuse to try and impose even more sanctions on them, to try and cripple them economically, because sadly, throughout the Trump administration, they're trying to starve the Syrian people into submission to overthrow Assad. They're trying to starve the Iranian people into submission to remove Rouhani and the IRGC, etc. They're trying to starve the Venezuelan people into submission to remove Maduro. These are statements of fact, and that's the thing that disappoints me probably more than anything with US foreign policy. I can understand why walking away from Syria per se is not the easiest thing for the US to do, or walking out of Afghanistan. There are arguments why that would be difficult and problematic, but to try and literally starve nations into submission. And they've tried it with Cuba as well, and to some extent Nicaragua. This is despicable and appalling behavior. And I'm sorry this has happened during the Trump administration. So if Trump's not responsible, who is? And why has Trump not removed them from an office and not allowing this to be done? And he hasn't. And we've seen the recent Caesar Act in Syria, which is exactly that, trying to starve Syrian people, literally. So they're on their knees and they want that, and they think they'll blame Assad, and then Assad will get removed. To play that kind of game with human lives, I'm sorry. It's beyond reprehensible. There is no excuse for it. There's no justification for it. And I'm sorry, but if anyone supports Trump, then at least get in touch with Trump and say, excuse me, why the hell are you doing this to these people? What is the justification for this? Because it is unacceptable. And again, it comes back to the point, he's the president, the buck stops with him. You can't have it where when anything good or is perceived to be good, oh, it's Trump, but when something isn't, or it's perceived to be negative, or in this case, despicable, oh, it's not Trump's responsibility. So who's the president? And if he's not the president, then the question is, who is? And on that basis, why is there all this, faux belief that Trump is going to lead America to this promised land?
Well, I know Trump obviously is persona non grata in all of this, but it goes back to something I mentioned before, where all these things are occurring, the economic, the military, the geopolitical. Most leadership in the world today is either incompetent or they're puppets for the regimes, for the cabals that want something, greater. As you said, we mentioned before, and we talked about this, something we didn't really want to expand upon. What was going on with India, between India and China, the Cold War that the U.S. and the rhetoric and the trade deals stuff going between the U.S. and China, all this attack from the U.S. at China as the new bogeyman. Well, on the flip side, you have all these other countries that are, whether the State Department or the CIA is trying to make China this big bogeyman, et cetera. And China's like, oh, we're just going to take the Spratlys and we're going to, make our demands here. We're going to go into Hong Kong and say enough. We're just going to annex it and do this type of thing. Well, the problem is that besides the fact that the media doesn't really give the true information of what is going on, the U.S. is a dying empire. And it's, whether you go back to JFK at the Bay of Pigs, he wasn't running the country. Nearly every president going the bureaucracy and the deep state runs the country. And a lot of times the president has to make the apologies or either stand by, make it look like he doesn't have control if he allows it to happen. There are agencies that have a bigger and much deeper control over geopolitical and even financial events. It reminds me of what happened with Obama when government shut down. I think it was in 2013, 2014. He didn't go and get Boehner, the head of the Speaker of the House, to the White House to try to stop the government shutdown. He brought in 15 bank CEOs, and those bank CEOs told Obama how this government shutdown and the policies that were going to be done. So I know that, yeah, Trump is the president, but the president doesn't have as much power as we think he does.
Oh yeah, no, I'm only saying this not because you and I know only too well the reality. The reason I'm saying this is because there is too many people out there who actually believe Trump is in charge and Trump is making all his decisions and Trump's going to do all these things. Well, the reason I'm saying this is to prove categorically that that is not the case. And the idea that, that there are all these wonderful magical things are on the horizon in the US and have been for, for the last 3 years just isn't a reality because of exactly the reason why I don't believe for 1 minute that Trump in of himself would actually agree to a Caesar Act that is looking to starve the Syrian people into submission. I don't believe that's the reality. Do I believe Trump actually realizes that's what it intends to do? No, I don't think he does. I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why you can argue that to be the case. But at the end of the day, I'm saying it not because I am surprised by this or think it's anything out of the ordinary in an historical context, but merely to emphasize the fact that we can't have this idea that Trump is going to resolve problems when all these things keep happening. And, we could list hundreds of things that have gone on in his administration, which isn't becoming of the president people think he is. And that is the reason why I'm mentioning.
Yeah. And I'm in agreement with that. I mean, he's made, I'm not going to stand with him with many of the, cabinet members that he's brought in there. But what I've also come to the realization is that he's had to bring in those individuals. Otherwise, if he took in some of the ones, like right now, there's still 300 cabinet members, or not 300, but dozens, if not over 100 administration cabinet positions that he's been waiting for the Senate to ratify from the day he got into office. Now, if he brings in one of the deep staters that's part of their cabal, Pompeo goes in real quick. But if he wants somebody else to function in there, the Congress will ensure that he doesn't get his cabinet members. So he's stuck with a lot of these deep staters and who are going to do their own thing. And that's why I'm saying is the president no longer has the power that is perceived as this executive thing. And even Obama didn't run his administration. He brought in the Valerie Jarrett's and the Susan Rice's, and they did whatever they wanted to do.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not. It's not like this is a precedent that we've not seen before. But the only thing I would say with regards to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is part of China. And, we can argue whether these rules and regulations that China has then brought in should have been or shouldn't have been, but China has every legal authority to do what it's done. And that because if you look at how the handover happened, it is part of China. Okay, it's autonomous, it has its own government, and until now, China hasn't enforced anything. And yes, there's a rationale why China's done it, and people will disagree or agree. It doesn't really matter. But China has every authority to do what it's done because the agreement it signed with the United Kingdom in 1997 was exactly that it was a handover from the UK to China. So I think it's important to emphasize that because there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding that Hong Kong wasn't part of China, and therefore why is China invoking, very well, some people perceive as controversial rules to do with whether people can protest or who is perceived to be foreign agents and et cetera, and China does what China does, and whether it's not really about agreeing or disagreeing in the context of the conversation. It's just China has every legal authority to do that. The West can try to spin it otherwise, but unfortunately, that's simply not the case.
Well, you bring up a great point in that. Isn't it interesting that when Kim Jong-un finally says enough, and they start doing missile tests again, and scare South Korea a little bit, Then you have China. Just, you know what? We're going to go into Hong Kong. We're going to institute this new policy, and there has been zero. I mean, besides the jawboning, that's always going to be out there, the rhetoric, but there's been zero movement, military or otherwise, by the U.S. on any of these things. I think we've come to the realization, especially even more than the COVID, hampering things down. But the U.S. they've got two things that they can do. They can use a political pressure over smaller countries, sort of like the way they're trying to do with Venezuela, with Syria, etc. But when it comes to big countries and their allies, the only thing they have left is that economic pressure with the dollar, with SWIFT, with the sanctions. But that's only going to go for so long. And the more that they do it, the more that they put the reserve currency in danger. And once the reserve currency is no longer accepted, then the U.S., all of its military, everything is done.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we're not really going to discuss this in detail, but I want to mention this briefly because I've had, obviously there's quite a cross-pollination between my subscribers and the Gadfly. I've had a lot of people lately asking me to make some comment regarding the coronavirus. Now, I'm not going to talk about the virus itself. Even though I have some scientific background here, I'm not going to discuss that. But equally, I will leverage that. I don't expect people who don't know anything about the science to talk with authority about it. I think that's the first standpoint. The only points I want to make on this is, can someone please explain to me if it's some great big planned epidemic, why China, Russia, and Iran are all playing a game to benefit a Western cabal or Western special interest, who apparently want to wreck Western economies and to roll out all these hideous things on Western nations. Why would Russia, China, and Iran play a game of that nature when it damages their economy, risks destabilizing their own governments, their own societies? Why would they do this? And the simple answer is they wouldn't do it. In fact, if it was some grand Western plan, they would do the reverse. They'd be saying, we don't have any cases in our country. We don't have these problems. This is all a gigantic illusion. Bring in all your Western film crews and we can show you we have no cases. Can you imagine the PR disaster that would be if there was a big planned epidemic and it didn't really exist? So, and that is an irrefutable point. There is absolutely no justification. And on the subject of doing all these things to deliberately wreck Western economies, well, it's quite interesting that the one thing they don't want people to do is to buy physical metal. And yet all this current crisis is done is driven more and more people into buying physical metal, which is driving now the price of gold and silver, which is the last thing they want to see. And also, I don't agree with the measures the UK is rolling out per se. They've come out with a bunch of announcements today, and we don't need to go into specifics, but they're trying to offer VAT decreases. So it encourages people to go out and spend money in the hospitality and entertainment industry. They're also going to offer grants of £5,000 and up to 10,000 if you're, depending on your income, for home development. So you could have new windows put in, or solar panels if you want, or loft insulation, or all manner of things. Grants, you don't have to pay it back. And they want to roll out new policies in the future. Now, I'm not saying I agree with what they're doing, and it's a long-term answer, but it doesn't demonstrate to me that there's this plan now on this basis to go and wreck economies deliberately, when the UK government, whether you agree with it or think it's viable or not, is doing exactly the opposite and doing everything it thinks it's possible to prevent economic implosion. Because as someone pointed out to them, in 2 months, the UK economy fell 25%. That was bigger than growth in the last 18 years. Now, there again, you wouldn't do this if your intention was some nefarious plan, whether you were taking advantage of the coronavirus or you actually tried to implement it that you would wreck the economy and then do everything to try and prevent it being destroyed. It's simply illogical. It makes absolutely no sense.
Well,
These are factually irrefutable statements. So therefore, I get to the point where I don't want to discuss the endless ins and outs of what this virus is and all the things that apparently have happened or didn't happen and all these grandiose statements regarding it. There are simple facts you cannot refute. And not one person has given me an adequate explanation for why China, Russia, and Iran seemingly are all playing this game along with these Western nations, because there is no justification, because there is zero reason why they would do this.
You know, I know that the media and that, of course, and Trump is propagating it with his tweets, the Wuhan flu, the Kung flu, that type of stuff. The fact, it is probably true that the escape or whatever of the virus occurred in China at some capacity, but we also know that there are Western controlled labs. We know that Fauci was involved in sending samples of that virus over there. I don't blame China and think that it's a conspiracy by China, Russia, whatever, to do this. I actually look at it more as in the Western. And the reason why I put more stock in this as a means by the Western cabals to tear down the economy is the way that the governors and the mayors of the cities have reacted. Okay. Whether it's during the riots and the looting, where simply they have pulled back, they have not been outraged. They keep the police from affecting it, and they stand there and say, "Well, these are peaceful rioters or peaceful protesters. They are paid to stand back and allow it to happen." What's going on with the lockdowns? I mean, frankly, there's so much coming out from the New England Journal of Medicine that masks really don't, outside of a hospital room, masks really don't do anything. So there's no point in doing this lockdown and killing your economy.
Yeah, no, look, we're not disagreeing or saying that the lockdown should be the way it is or anything. But one point with regards to the origins of the virus, the Spanish have come out and said, we found the coronavirus in March 2019.
Yeah.
So how does that square up that it originated in China? The problem is, at the end of the day, is too much of the information that's circulating regarding the coronavirus, regarding its origins, regarding all these things, has been completely muddied by statements that have no basis in scientific fact. And okay, people dismiss science, fine, but then people cherry pick the bit of science that backs up what they think, because then it vindicates their opinion. Well, you can't cherry pick bits of science and say, well, this is correct. No, this is wrong. Just, it's like you have to take all encompassing. I don't disagree for 1 minute. The virus was completely overestimated. Britain was going to not have a lockdown. It then did, based on models that have been completely proved to be incorrect. And subsequently, and here's the other thing, at the start it was, oh, they're never going to open anything up. They're just going to keep us all in lockdown and then roll all these things out. Well, hang on. The UK is rolling everything out. You can go to the pub now. You can go to the hairdresser. You can go to the cinema. You can go anywhere. Okay, there are still some restrictions which may seem ridiculous to people. I understand that. But the whole premise at the start is fallen away. It's not reality. And this is what keeps happening. There's all these statements made and the statement falls away. And then the next statement comes out and that falls away. Then there's another statement and that falls away. Yes, there are many things that are completely wrong how it was handled. And a lot of it is incompetence. A lot of it is sheer inability to handle the situation in an appropriate manner. Although, with all due respect, it's great for us to say this. But if I was suddenly the Prime Minister of the UK and I got presented with data saying to me this, I'd have to go, well, if I ignore this and it happens, what is the consequences for me as a person, not just in my dereliction of duty to the people of my nation, but how am I going to go to bed at night and then subsequently find all these people did die as a result? Okay, it hasn't happened, but that's with hindsight. And then the other problem is, people say, well, there was only 3 million cases in the world. It's irrelevant. Then, oh, it's only 5 million. Oh, it's only 7 million. Oh, it's 9. Oh, well, it's 13 million. And when's it going to end? Now, okay, the case isn't the issue because for me, it's the mortality rate that is the concern. And I don't doubt there are people who've tried to take advantage of this, tried to make money out of it, tried to exploit situations, but that doesn't mean that it was ever an intentional thing and it was deliberately foisted on the world. Because, as I say, why is the UK doing everything it can to unlock everything and try and stimulate the economy? I don't agree with some of the things they're doing. I can see why there might be some very short-term benefits. It more depends what they do, and they claim they're going to do more in September, October, November, and so on. Well, okay, let's wait and see if that's a reality. That doesn't demonstrate to me this big nefarious plan that we keep being sold. That is my point. And as I say, I come back. I haven't had one. I've had about 300 or 400 people getting in touch with me since this virus thing, telling me all sorts of things. And as soon as I go back, say, give me an explanation for China, Russia, and Iran, you don't get a single response because there is no response. There is no logical reason that Putin and Xi and Rouhani are going to play some nefarious game for Western special interests to wreck economies and vaccinate the world with whatever people believe they're going to vaccinate, when it's of absolutely zero benefit to them. What are they going to play a game that benefits these special interests and cabal who are trying to destroy China, Russia, and Iran? They've tried to have assassination attempts on all these leaders. They're trying constant regime change, trying to wreck these nations. And we're seriously supposed to believe that Putin, Xi, and Rouhani are going to go, yeah, it's okay, we'll play this game with you. I mean, I'm sorry, that's why the whole discussion of this blows out of the water. And it makes the whole thing ridiculous.
Well, you make the great point, because whenever you're looking to find the root cause of something, it's that old adage, follow the money. Well, who really benefits the most from this scare of a pandemic, from the lockdowns, etc.? It's the Fed, Treasury, the ECB, and all of these, all of their banks, corporations, and institutions that were on the cusp of insolvency, collapse, etc. And sure enough, look at most of the policies that have been implemented, taking balance sheets to, ungodly levels, bailing out everybody and their brother, bringing interest rates down to zero. Now all of a sudden, everything is in place for them to want to say, okay, let's see about implementing a full-on digital currency system. And you're seeing that with Europe. You're seeing that with the US now. They're talking about looking at digital currency and digital systems. So,
but the point is, the US can roll out a digital dollar. So what? The world's not going to embrace it.
Who's
going to embrace it?
The
American people.
You missed the point. Yeah.
What?
You missed the point.
It's not going to work.
At that point, the dollar won't be the reserve currency. Okay. It's the same thing with Europe. More than anything, what this has done by sealing the borders is that countries are breaking apart. They're looking at their own. They're not putting their trust in Brussels. They're not putting their trust in the ECB. As a matter of fact, they're starting to see them as more of an antagonist. But the digital currency system would not be for international, because at this certain point, respect for the dollar as a reserve currency, there is no respect. It's more like the debts that are dollar denominated out there. That's the only reason that they're having to do this. But at a certain point, it's going to be out. But it's control over the U.S. people. That's what it's looking mostly for.
Well, yes, but okay. Predominantly, how many people are essentially using a digital dollar already? How many people carry around huge amounts of cash and spend it in? It's a dying thing, and it has been for decades. This whole cashless society thing was largely morphed out of the alt media and an idea to scare people half to death, like lots of other stories that have emanated out the alternative media. A cashless society is, as the deep state cabal structure exists, is never going to happen because it will destroy their opium, their narco industry, which is $1 trillion a year. It'll destroy all these nefarious things and disgusting, despicable trade that exist in cash terms and isn't done through physical transactions. And also, banks have enormous amounts of physical cash that they have to use for, shall we say, less than legitimate transactions with other entities and individuals. So you cannot just get rid of cash. I've said it many times, but I'm sorry, it's an absolute statement of fact that they're not doing it for that intention. The reason they want to now roll out digital currencies is, and even though they don't have a clue what that means or how to do it, is because China's doing it. And they suddenly went, oh, China's doing it, Russia's doing it, we need to do it. Well, what purpose are you doing it? You don't need to internationalize the dollar. That's why China's rolling out a digital currency, is to internationalize the yuan, not to replace the yuan. As they've said, we still have a physical yuan. You can still go to an ATM. It's not a replacement. But again, it's a story that has done the rounds for the last decade or longer. And it's been said so many times now, it's become an established fact. And it's not an established fact. It's actually not reality. The other issue is you're right, with regards to the virus, there's no doubt about it. The Fed and the ECB and the Bank of England and other banks went, well, now we can print tons of money, and yes, we can notionally prop up all these entities, and we can buy all the bonds, and we can buy everything up. You know, all bust businesses, we can buy all their debt, and we can do whatever just to prop the illusion up. And people go, well, that's the reason why they did all this. But ultimately, all they've done is destroyed the dollar. They have not stopped businesses. Businesses are going to collapse no matter how much money you pump into them. It does nothing but destroys their own empire. When the dollar dies, it's game over. So all they've allowed themselves to do, if this was a great nefarious plan, was to print trillions of dollars to destroy the dollar, destroy their credibility, and in fact accelerate the demise of the dollar. And we're seeing, since they did all this, the amount of treasuries that are being dumped by foreign entities is staggering, and it will continue. So the nefarious plan, if they did, is completely blown up in their face. No, what it was is they saw an opportunity to exploit something, but they're so dumb and stupid, they didn't realize the consequences, that in fact it would blow up in their faces. But that's desperation. And again, it comes back to the point, they're not these great omnipotent beings. And we've highlighted on my website 100 examples of their failures in 5 years. But again, this is part of this alt media illusion. It's fed people a whole bunch of ideas that has no basis in reality. I don't doubt that they seek to exploit this, but they're not exploiting it in a successful way. They're exploiting it in their own to their own detriment.
But Paul, I'm in complete agreement with you. I'm not saying that it's going to succeed. I'm saying this is what they're trying to do. And the reason why is it goes back to something that we've probably been in agreement before. The reason the United States has looked like such a buffoon geopolitically, economically, and across the world stage is because the establishment that is in there still has Cold War mentality, the Boltons of the world. Okay, so their actions in Syria, regime change, this whole thing, the world has evolved from that post Soviet Union. That's why the West, that's why Europe, it wanted to form, and they brought in their own currency, and they wanted to become their own establishment. But the United States is still built on that mentality of the Cold War thing, where they think that, one, they destroyed the Soviet Union economically. Two, they've got to stop communism, yada, 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 yada. And so all these policies that are being implemented are, in fact, they're doomed to fail. But this is the mindset that they're doing. So when I say that they want to implement it, I'm not saying it's going to succeed, because there's so many factors. Obviously, the drug trade for one, is a cash business. It's the same thing with going on with here. If they decide to go negative interest rates with the dollar, you're doing that with the global reserve currency that 95 countries are pegged to. It's not going to fly. But on the other side of the coin, why did they implement the changing of savings and checking accounts under the Dodd-Frank Act to be a liability to the bank where they can rehypothecate it and recapitalize? You start messing too much with it. There's an interesting story that's come out since the lockdown. One, people are hoarding cash. Two, there's a shortage of coins. People are not spending the cash and coins that they have at home. More and more, they're taking what they can out of the banks, the old prepper mentality. So the more that they try to implement, the worse it's going to get, because people are just going to say, screw it, we're going to take cash. And when are they going to wake up and suddenly say, you know what? If I'm going to hold all this cash, and this cash is being devalued every single day by the Fed, by government policies, by massive money printing, when are the people finally going to, not the big investors, but the people, going to suddenly wake up and say, well, hell, I'm going to store my cash in gold and silver because that's the only thing that's actually protecting my purchasing power. And I think, besides when you said that the big players, when they really start getting into buying gold and silver, not just the central banks, but when the regular individual retailers start doing it, then I think it's going to be fireworks. The fun's really going to begin.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the only reason I mention these points is because when you deal with those level of facts of what's unfolded, then everyone has to question every other aspect of narratives that are out there. Now, there's a lot of grey areas with regards to how you diagnose. I mean, I've even heard stories saying that that the virus doesn't exist. Well, explain why. I mean, forget whether people agree with vaccines or not. That's a separate issue. China and Russia have done vaccine trials, and people have displayed antibodies. So if the virus doesn't exist, what exactly if they? Are we supposed to believe that China and Russia are wasting all their time on a vaccine that they perceive to be necessary? Whether people agree is beside the point. Again, it's another statement of fact. And one of the big things we had at the outset was, oh, they'll have a vaccine ready and they'll roll it out straight away. Well, that hasn't happened. And in fact, it looks like China and Russia will beat them to the punch with developing a vaccine. So another, I'm sorry, gigantic illusion gets blown out of the water. And I'm sorry, but that's the part for me is the issue. I don't mind people having ideas or theories about things, but when certain facts are irrefutable and it doesn't fit this narrative, why are people persisting with a narrative that doesn't fit these facts? And therefore, that I have to ask the question, why would you do this? And the reason I've come on and said what I've said today is because I've had a lot of people who are on the Gadfly and the Sirius Report who've said to me, can you please make statements on the Gadfly that you've talked to us on previously on the podcast to emphasize these factual things that then should give people some guidance as to go, well, hang on a minute. These being factually true, what does this mean in reality? Because if the virus was discovered in March 2019, then how does that play out with all the theories about how it all tied in around matters last October and things at the Wuhan and all these kind of things? It doesn't. So therefore, if that doesn't stack up, what are the factual or things that are perceived to be factually correct don't stack up either? And what at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to get to the reality of things or not? And for me, I don't have any skin in the game. It doesn't matter to me whether it was a whole gigantic pandemic or it was just naturally evolving. It is of no relevance to me to pursue one side or the other. All I want to do is understand realities and to be able to say, okay, on this basis, this is what's happening, this is what's unfolding. I don't have any desire to be on any side of the fence about anything, because frankly, when you choose a side of the fence, you have to be extremely careful that you're on the right side of the fence. And I'm not disputing a lot of people's concerns about things. I'm not doubting that there are grave mistakes or whatever you may perceive them to be done by the United Kingdom, done countless nations across the world, the US, and how they handle things and did things completely inappropriately. But what I would say is, and I said this probably 4 weeks ago, maybe longer, I think the UK's realised they've made a big mistake. I think they realise that it's over-egged the extent of the virus, and watch what they'll do. They'll start on rolling everything, all the lockdown measures. They'll start putting financial incentives to stimulate the economy, and this has all happened. Well, that doesn't suggest to me a nation that actually was trying to roll out some nefarious plan. I'm sorry, but if anyone wants to argue to the contrary, please try and explain how those measures stack up against this idea that there was some grand conspiracy surrounding the virus, because frankly, it doesn't. Otherwise, we'd still be in lockdown and the government would do nothing to support anybody. I mean, and why would they give grants of £5,000 to £10,000 for people for home improvements if they're trying to stuff everyone? You wouldn't, would you?
Nope.
I mean, there's just one small example. Why would you do this? You wouldn't. So therefore, there's one little fact. If they're doing that, how does that stack up with all the other ideas about what this is? It doesn't. Does it mean it's the right decision necessarily? Arguably, yes and no, or maybe no, or maybe yes. It doesn't really matter. We just have to deal. If you actually deal with the facts of what's happened, and strip all, just deal with the path of least resistance that says this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. You can follow this logical train of thought through the whole thing. I'm not disputing. Forget the sort of byproduct of nefarious behavior by individuals who are seeking to profit from this. I don't doubt that, but because that's just opportunism. It's disgusting opportunism, but it's opportunism. Just follow the path of least resistance through the whole process. And you don't have any of this ambiguity and grey areas. When you start to introduce lots of different theories, it completely muddies the waters, and the path of least resistance becomes a war of attrition between what we want to believe and what we don't want to believe. And for me, it's not about believing in anything. It's about, this is reality. It's like people think I'm really pro-China and I'm really pro-Russia, and well, why don't you go and live in Russia and China? I'm just telling you what China and Russia are doing. I told the British government and the US government a decade ago what was going on. I wrote they probably just got this thing around and threw it in the bin and no one read it. It wasn't like I tried to warn people, but as ever, it's rather like 2007. When I worked in the banking system, I warned what was happening in 2008. I said, this is exactly what's going to happen. Everyone laughed. Everyone said a load of nonsense. Then it happens. So it's about seeking what actually happens, and not because I have a particular axe to grind against any administration. I mean, I'd love to be talking for the last 3 years about all the achievements of the Trump administration. Nothing would please me more, because that was the understanding that what he was supposed to do. And okay, for whatever reason, he's failed to do that. But trying to pretend he hasn't failed, how does that further our discourse and understanding? That's why I get frustrated with the alt media, because it's not largely about trying to see truth and reality. It's just, let's present some argument and let's just try and galvanize people who like to agree with us. Well, yeah, that's not progress.
Maybe it's time we rejigger Mao's famous statement that power resides at the barrel of one psychopathy. So, anyway, Paul, anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think I've probably said enough. Yeah. But you know, look, honestly, the reason I don't want to go on about this often, but I've had a lot of frustrated people getting in touch with me and saying, look, I know why you don't want to talk about it. I know why you don't want to discuss it. But can you please just put some salient facts out there, which, you know, might make people think for a minute, okay, why is this happening? I'm not going to discuss it again. That's the end of the discussion. You know, to a large extent, most of it, I'm sick to death of it, because it's just this endless, tenuous links to all these things. And to be brutally honest, I've had a lot of people getting in touch with me saying they're sick of hearing about these things themselves. And I think you have to draw a line under this at some point and say, enough's enough. What is the outcome of this? What's the fallout of this? What is actually happening? And maybe at some point in 5, 10, 20 years, we might actually come to understand the absolute finer points of this. But I think we have to deal with facts as best we can. And where we don't have facts, let's not substitute them with theories and ideas that don't bear scrutiny.
I'm in complete agreement. You know, trying to worry about the conspiracy or even the bloody truth about its origins, about all that. You know, at best, or I should say at most, it's best to use it only anecdotally, as it ties into things that are being done, policies are being made, and how people are reacting, whether in a local or national level. But anyway, Paul, want to thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts, your ideas, and your great wisdom here today on the Gadfly. Just want to let everybody know, once this podcast is posted, make sure to leave comments, ask any questions regarding the things that Paul and I discussed today. And until we get together next, everybody have a great Wednesday.